Today is Friday, July 8, 2011. My name is Joe Meunier of the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm with videographer John Bishop. We are in the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. to do an oral history interview for the Civil Rights History Project, which is a joint undertaking of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we're delighted today to be with Mr. Courtland Cox. Mr. Cox, thank you so much for sharing some of this part of the afternoon with us, and thank you for coming over.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. And one other quick note, we are not recording to the camera cards, but to the hard drive. Okay. I thought I would start maybe with just having you sketch a little bit of your family history and history as a child, because I know that some of your time was in Trinidad and some here.
Right. Well, I was born in New York, in Harlem in 1941. And my mother moved me and my sister to the West Indies, to Trinidad, where my grandmother and our family were 4 years later, in 1945. I stayed in Trinidad from 1945 to 1952. And then I came back to New York after my grandmother died in 52 and lived in Harlem for a couple of years and then moved to the Bronx. I attended Catholic school, St. Helena's, and then, went from, well, actually Catholic St. Aloysius Grammar School, which was actually an interesting because it was all African American nuns at St. Aloysius, a whole order of that. And then I went to St. Helena's and then went to Howard University. My mother sent me to Catholic school because, at that point, it cost $10 a month, which was, serious money in 1952, 54. But also, she wanted to make sure that I had the best education that she could get. And at that point, she was not too well sold on public schools. I grew up in the projects, mostly in New York. And at that time, you could see a lot of the issues that we see today in the 50s. I mean, a lot of people were doing drugs, mainly marijuana and heroin. And of all the people that I grew up with, my peer group, probably only 3 of us graduated from high school: my sister, myself, and one other. And the reason I was not impacted, I think, was because of that time I spent in Trinidad where education was stressed in my family. So I can look back and see my cousins, and they're numerous. I mean, the women have PhDs, the men have been, accomplished in education, and it was a strong presence. I mean, there was no assumption that you would not go to college. It was assumed that you did, and and my mother said, that, your cousins are doing X, Y, and Z, and we expect this of you. So, I mean, the expectation was deep and internal. When I left St. Helena's, and it's interesting, when I got to St. Helena's, there were only 4 African Americans in the school. By the second year, I was by myself. So that was quite an interesting thing during that time.
In the Bronx.
In the Bronx, because, there was a sense of isolation. And one of the things that I felt, in that time was I would go to school, but as I was coming home, I would hide my books because I would try to, I kind of lived in both worlds, the world of going to school and the world of being where, people were. I mean, it was very interesting. The young people I grew up with, my peer group, because I had an accent, because I had a different history, they had a lot of respect for me. They respected I was different, in the sense that I was going to school and I wasn't trying to do different things. They just thought I was different, and that's fine. And so I had some space because of that. Um,
Can you say a word about your sister and other siblings?
my sister is Lorraine Cleveland, Lorraine Cox, and she, as I said, she's the younger sister by about 2.5 years. That's it. And my father, I think the last time I saw him, I might have been 10 years old. I haven't, I saw him probably at that point, so did not see him. He was not a major factor in my life. Um, but my sister is, went to during the health area and is still, working in the health. She became a registered nurse, went to medical school for a while, but had some issues, and so she's still doing the nursing.
Yeah. How did you get your attention pointed towards Howard?
My cousin went to Howard. My house was the stop for all my relatives coming to the United States. My mother was the head of the family branch here, so everybody came here. So my cousin Erskine, who was coming, who was a little older, but he came to go to Howard, and he was, I guess, maybe in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. So he came here, spent some time, going to Howard, maybe 2.5 years, and went to medical school, became a doctor, OBGYN. And, my view is, okay, well, he's doing it. I might as well do it. It's not, And at that time, you could go and, I mean, because I had not figured out what I was going to do. And at that time, you could go take a test. I guess you didn't have to take the SATs and stuff like that. You could just go take a test. And so I got on the bus one day, and Greyhound bus one day, and came down to Washington by myself, took the test, went back to New York, and I passed the exam, and they said, hey, why don't you come on down? And at that time, tuition at Howard University was $7.50 a semester credit. So basically, you could save a little over $100, get you 15 hours. Room was $40, board was $40, and you could, So I worked in the post office, and save money to go to school.
Were you a political adolescent at all in your high school years?
Not political in the sense, but aware. I mean, because I was part of a discussion. Part of 2 or 3 discussions. The whole question of segregation and race was much more pervasive in terms of people's assumption of what you could do, the barriers that existed, and so forth. So there was always discussion of that in kids who were 14 and 15. As I think back, people were very aware at 14 and 15 of what was going on in society. Then we had another group of older guys, older at that point, maybe in the 20s, who were in the jazz scene. So they would talk about the culture, they talk about the music, they talk about Coltrane, they talk about Monk, they talk about all these people, so there was a sense of a culture and a history that was delivered by these older guys that, gave me some sense of that. But in terms of politics, no, I was aware of what was going on, but also aware of other kinds of things, but no organized kinds of political discussion, no.
Yeah. Tell me what you encountered when you got to Howard, what the campus was like, what your sense of what you were going to do was, and how you settled in.
I think I didn't have a clear sense of what I was going to do. But, I did have a sense of right and wrong, and kind of was impacted by what was beginning to go on in the South, particularly with Emmett Till. And politics, back to the political question, I was very much aware of what's going on in Emmett Till. I was very much aware of what was going on in Montgomery. So, but I didn't have I was just aware of it. And I had a sense of it, but not, any great depth in terms of understanding. When I got to Howard, there was, places all over the place. I mean, Washington was a very segregated city at the time. Whether you're talking about housing, whether you were talking about black and white ads in the Washington Post, whether you were talking about the police department, whether you're talking about trying clothes on in the various department stores. I mean, all those things existed. So, I was faced with it in a way that I wasn't faced with it in New York. Also, at that point with the sit-in, so there was a small group of people who decided to do stuff at Glen Echo in Washington, and we formed the Nonviolent Action Group. And some of the people who later went on to really be prominent SNCC were all part of that. And we did two things. We did sympathetic actions for things going on in the South, but we did, we went out to the Eastern Shore of Maryland and demonstrated there. We and Stokely Carmichael, who was in school with me at the time, was famous for helping to organize these demonstrations because he would promise, okay, we're going to go demonstrate, but we got a great party after the demonstrations. And and so young people want to do that. Some of the other things that we did while I was at Howard, I mean, RFK Stadium, when the Redskins were first here, we picketed it because there were no African American football players. We Route 40, which was segregated, the route from Washington to New York. We were, involved in those demonstrations. We worked with Julius Hobson, who was at Core Senior, we were his shock troops. I mean, Julius was, older than we were, but when he wanted a demonstration, he would call on us to be, the shock troops. And we did other things at Howard. When we had the outside things that we did in terms of demonstrations, but we also created Project Awareness. And Project Awareness, I mean, the first three things that we did, I mean, I'll never forget them. The first was a debate between Bayard Rustin and Malcolm X on the question of segregation versus integration. The second was a debate with Norman Thomas and Herman Kahn on the question of thermonuclear warfare. And the third was a symposium with Jim Baldwin, Ossie Davis, John Killens, moderated by Sterling Brown, and for the after party, Sidney Poitier flew in so that just to see what the boys were doing. So I mean, we for people our age at that time, we were whatever we were. I mean, and then the other thing that was also clear, we were also in the student council. Tom Kahn, who was a member of NAG, was the treasurer of the student council. Stokely Carmichael was in the student council, student government. And then the other thing that was Mike Thurwell, who was, member of NAG, ran the newspaper and got great awards for the quality of the newspaper. So we functioned at, internally, externally in terms of demonstrations, but in terms of Howard, in terms of people who could organize and do things, we were there. We were in the leadership of it. And we were also encouraged by a lot of the professors because they thought they adopted us as their children, particularly Sterling Brown. He would invite us to his house. He would, have, discussions. He would talk to us about Du Bois. He would talk to us about, other people that we've heard about. He would, not only play at his house the jazz music or the blues. He would come to our dormitory and talk about the history. He would talk about the poetry. We had, others, Conrad Snowden. We had other professors. We had others who, just thought that we were doing what they would like to do. And they tried to give us all the encouragement that they could.
Tell me about little bit more about this group and your role in relation to all these other folks you've mentioned.
Well, the NAG was really run by three people, three large egos, I think. Ed Brown, who is, Rap's older brother, Stokely Carmichael, and myself. And I think, people look to us in terms of the, in terms of leadership issues. I mean, I think that when I did a lot of stuff on the project awareness stuff in terms of organization and pulling it together. Also, a lot of stuff on the demonstrations and so forth. I didn't do too much in the student council, didn't do too much on the student newspapers, but in those two, we were very active.
Yeah, tell me about how NAG and all of so many of you deepened your engagement with SNCC.
Well, I mean, at that point, SNCC in the early days was a student nonviolent coordinating committee. So it was really a coordination of student groups across the country. So therefore, NAG was one of the student groups across the country. Nashville was another, Atlanta was another. So we were just part of. So we sat in with, I sat on the coordinating council for SNCC, and I guess on the executive council at a committee at some point, to help pull the organization together.
Yeah, you traveled to Atlanta.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to be going down on Highway 29, and I remember gas was 29 cents a gallon. Now I couldn't drive, but I'd ride down there. So gas was 29 cents a gallon. Cigarettes were 20 cents a pack.
Did you smoke?
I used to smoke. I used to smoke until 1971, and I was on my way to Africa, and I was at LaGuardia Airport, and I saw that cigarettes had gotten to 70 cents a pack, and I said, in a machine, I said, I know where this is going. It's time for me to end this conversation. So I stopped smoking.
Are there interesting? Yeah. Are there things that stand out vividly in your memory from those early trips to Atlanta for those SNCC meetings?
The SNCC meetings or the trips?
Well, they'd both be very interesting, but I'm thinking of the SNCC meetings.
At the SNCC, they were, the good thing about, the meetings were, and the discussions were interminable, and we talked about everything. I think probably the thing that's most important, as I think about it, I've just thought about this lately. Most of the young people were asking why, and they given the basis, given the kinds of things that they face, they were asking why. At the SNCC meetings, we've thought about how to change, and everybody said, why not? Okay? You paraphrasing that famous poem. It seems to me the difference and the real genius of the young people, and we're talking 17 to 22, of that group, was that we moved from asking why the situation existed the way it did to talking about why not change it in a way that we should be living. And once you cross that barrier and don't feel you have to ask those who created the situation to make the change for you, then you are free. And I think the things that struck me about those conversations about the 17 to 22-year-olds, that the barriers of normal thinking and intellectual thought were broken, and the discussions about where we should be going, what we should be doing, and so forth were limitless. I think that's the thing that, it didn't strike me then, but it strikes me now.
Yeah. Also looking back in that context, you had mentioned that that your peer group in the Bronx could accept you as someone who was somehow a little bit different.
Yes.
Because your life experience had been different.
Right.
You'd come at time of journey. was there any parallel then to your experience inside this group of young activists at SNCC? Did you feel that your personal history distinguished you in some way that mattered, say, to your participation in those conversations, your perspectives, your philosophies?
I didn't think so. Okay, but
Okay.
I mean, there was always this West Indian discussion. I don't know. It even appeared in Time or Newsweek magazine, where people considered people like Stokely, Ivanhoe, and myself, to be, quote, have a different view because we came from environments that might have been a little more less restrictive. I never bought into that.
Tell me, if you would, about, actually I want to take you back to have you tell me about the Rustin-Malcolm X debate.
It was amazing. It was amazing. They had just built Crampton Auditorium at Howard University. The capacity was 1,500. And I mean, leading up to it, we tried to get the professor who was the head of the government to moderate the debate. I'm not going to say his name. He thought it was beneath him to have Malcolm X at Howard University. We went to Emmett Dorsey, who was a professor at Howard, a wonderful, a big bear of a man, who would say in his class that racism is architectonic to the Constitution of the United States. And he would point to the 3/5 clause. He agreed to moderate the debate. We had a dinner before the debate with Malcolm and Byatt. And Professor Dorsey was talking. And Malcolm said, "Professor, I think we better let you speak tonight because you have much more information than anybody in this room," which was really true. We got to the debate. I mean, Malcolm had maybe about 300 of his followers in the front. Byatt gets up, and I think he speaks first. He does speak first. Each participant had 30 minutes to speak. Byatt speaks 15 minutes, and he says, "You always hear my point of view through the press, everything. I now want to give Malcolm 15 of my minutes to help to give him to present." And Malcolm was, a dynamite speaker. And the thing that struck me was Malcolm, if you listen to Message of the Grassroots, that's basically the speech that he gave, the album and this thing. And I hadn't heard it. This is 1961. I hadn't heard it. And he would tell a joke or something like that or clap, and they'd be applauding. And when he did that, his people would then do that. I mean, the discipline was phenomenal. I said, "Whoa, what is this?" And I will tell you, from that debate, people at Howard saw us different. I mean, that we could bring Malcolm X and Byatt Rustin, have 50 people were pounding on the door the whole night trying to get in. Because that was considered a big auditorium. We brought, kind of pizzazz and, all sorts of things there. People looked at us totally different after that. I mean, students, hey, these guys have something that we don't have. I think that's that gave us a little cachet that we probably wouldn't have had ordinarily.
Yeah. What was your early sense of...
Joe, let's pause for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, we're back.
We took a short break. I was going to ask about, you've just mentioned the Malcolm and Byatt Rustin debate, and these other things and how there's cachet attached. I'm remembering now that the question I wanted to ask was, shifting themes a little bit. Early on, how did you gauge the prospects of substantial, true kind of structural change through the nonviolent protest strategies that were emerging through SNCC?
We had big debates about that. We had, and the national group had one view, the Howard group had another. The Nashville group believed in nonviolence as a philosophy and a way of life. John is probably the poster child for that. Diane Nash, Jim Lawson, those guys. The people at Howard, we viewed nonviolence as a tactic. One of the things that the nonviolent people philosophy, those people, they felt that, you could appeal to men's hearts. My view, and which I've said to them, was that you might as well appeal to their livers because they're both organs of the body. There was nothing to that. You engaged in nonviolence because the other side had overwhelming force. There was not a sense that the other side would do the right thing if you told them. Because at the end of the day, the other side knew what it was doing to you better than you did. So it's not that they didn't know what they were doing, they wanted to do it. So we had huge, that was the source of early tension. Early 61, 62, so forth. We did not believe in nonviolence as a philosophy.
Kind of a parallel question. In these early years, especially when things heat up in the South, 62, 63, what was your evolving sense of what you might be able to expect from the federal government? If much of anything.
Slim and none. I think there were individuals, particularly John Doe, particularly Burke Marshall at the Civil Rights Division, who were, very helpful. But there was a story. It's sort of like, in the house was bombed in Macomb. I think this was 63, 64, maybe 64. And we went down there.
You were in Mississippi.
We were in Mississippi, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We went to Mr. Cone. The FBI was there. They said to us, look, don't make any mistake about it. We're here to protect the evidence. We're not here to guard you or protect you. Okay, that's first. Then the guy said to us, look, how many guns do you have? And we said, we don't have any guns. He said, well, I've got 2 and I'm scared to death. So you had 2 issues. First, their mandate was limited because, of both the local political issues, and which affected the federal political issues. And at the end of the day, most of these guys, as individuals, thought they would be overwhelmed. So, we tried to communicate to the federal government as much as we could communicate, and try to, in certain circumstances, try to do that. But, many of the people in SNCC, including myself, felt that, most of those agents who came from the South were of the South, and therefore sympathetic not to us, but to, the communities that they lived in.
Sure. Let me bring you back to 62 for a minute. In the spring, you and Stokely Carmichael and I think 1 or 2 others sat in at Robert Kennedy's office.
Oh, yes, we did. Butch Kahn was the other third person. Butch Kahn and Tom Kahn. You've really done your research.
Can you recall that?
Yes. It was funny. We went there and we went to Kennedy's office, and I think they were in a quandary as to what to do. And so basically they just said, okay, just leave them there and stuff like that. And then late at the afternoon, they were going to come and move us out of the building, take us out. So Butch Kahn started calling the press from Kennedy's office, and included the Soviet press and the people that he called. So then they came at the end of the day, and they were, we went limp and they were dragging us out. So as they were dragging us out, they probably got maybe 50, 60 feet down the hall. Stokely says, wait a minute. I forgot something in the office. So he gets up, goes and gets the stuff in the office, goes back to exactly where he was. So okay, so they just took us out the office and just say bye, see you. Just took us out the building and said bye bye, see you. So I mean, that's what I remember about it.
It's interesting how one of the things that's so interesting about doing these interviews in 2011 here is that the emotional mood about all this has shifted so much
Right.
that we say it and we recall these things with a smile, and yet you were there for what were just deadly serious reasons.
Oh yeah, no, we were very serious.
Absolutely.
Now, because we thought that the Kennedy administration, first of all, we thought that the Kennedy administration, particularly the way they dealt with Martin King, earlier, was basically an opportunist approach to things. We thought that Bobby Kennedy and the Justice Department was not being very serious. They were also very opportunistic and had a view that they would only do what they were pushed to do, even though the law of the land, which changed in '54 to be on the side of the ending of segregation. They bought into the go slow approach and don't disturb approach, and look, don't cause any political trouble for my brother approach. So we felt that at the end of the day, they were about themselves and not about, making this country a better place for everyone.
Yeah. Let me ask about two things that obviously you've been asked to give many interviews over the years, and two episodes are often the focus of a lot of attention, and I want to sort of take them up together because I
Okay.
think in some ways they have a relation. You can tell me if you agree. The struggle over the John Lewis speech at the
Yes.
March on Washington in August of '63, and a year later the Atlantic City MFDP
Right.
struggle at the Democratic National Convention. Because in both those instances, I think of them as having to do with that forceful and quite idealistic and quite hopeful push, really bumping up against some very, very rugged power. And so
No, I think I would take them two separately because I think the Atlantic City had a much more profound impact than March on Washington.
Okay, good.
The March on Washington, I was the representative for SNCC, and
To the steering committee.
for the steering committee, and for whatever reasons, at this point I can't remember, I passed out John's speech before the march
To the press.
to the press. Because I assumed I was trying to promote John's speech. I mean, that's why you would do that. Then we are at the march, and we get a call. Archbishop of Boyle says that he is not going to participate in the March on Washington, if the criticism of Kennedy's administration and the whole reference to marching through the South, but I think that last part about marching through the South of Sherman is a little, is a ruse, because they did not want the Kennedy administration criticized. And, we at that point, when I say we, John Lewis, Jim Foreman, myself, told Archbishop, Bide came to us at that point, and we told, he could tell Archbishop of Boyle to go straight to hell.
Regarding any changes to the speech.
Any changes to the speech. We were not going to change. And then what Bide did, and Bide is a very clever person, he went and got A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph said, I know, he gave us our propers, but he said, look, I have worked since 1941 to make this happen. And it is important that the coalition is held together. And it is out of respect for A. Philip Randolph that we went in the back of the Lincoln Memorial, Jim Foreman, John Lewis, Mildred Foreman, and myself, and we changed John's speech. Now, the way that was perceived in SNCC at that point was that, particularly me and Foreman, we caved in. And so the criticism was individual to us from the SNCC people. It wasn't the broader society. I think Atlantic City was a lot different. I mean, people worked all summer. They faced tremendous, hostilities. And they thought that they played by the rules that they were supposed to be playing. And everybody was engaged in that. We went to Atlantic City with the sense that if you presented the facts to the nation, then it would make a difference. The first clue was when Fannie Lou Hamer was speaking. Lyndon Johnson called a non-serious press conference to say that today is Tuesday, okay, and to take her off the air. But in the bowels of Atlantic City Convention Center, Bob Moses, Charlie Cobb, Ivanhoe Donaldson, all of us people were scrubbed. We put on suits and ties. All that sort of stuff. Some of us hadn't had ties on for some time. But we went around and we were able to pigeonhole enough people like Edith Green and others to support, the Mississippi Freedom Bank, at least at the Credentials Committee level. Then when it was known that we had enough enough representatives, the Lyndon Baines Johnson really started acting ugly. He called Hubert Humphrey and he told him, if you want the vice presidency, you better stop these people. He called people who were up for judgeships. He said, if you don't do this, you are through booking. Now, we had the list of people, and a congressman, whose name I will not put out here at this point, came to us. And I remember Bob Moses and I were in a meeting. And the congressman asked us for the list of people who weren't supportive. Because he said what he wanted to do was show, Lyndon Baines that he had, in fact, the kind of, support, and therefore to be able to move the agenda in our direction. Bob Moses just looked at him and stared. And I said to Bob, do you think he's going to steal the list? Bob hesitated a little more, and then he gave him the list. Do you know, if I saw the list, you've seen it. What that congressman did was use that to get the Johnson administration to go after each one of these people to get them to capitulate.
This was the minority, but sufficient minority.
Sufficient minority to do a minority report, yes. So this congressman, took the list and went and then, gave us, I wouldn't use the word betrayed, but it was close. At that point, we had, worked the whole time. We had, basically played by the rules that was established. And when it came out that, they had collapsed the group of minority representatives who would participate in Minority Report, what happened was they then offered 2 seats, in the balcony somewhere, 2 seats on the floor, and then the others could be sitting in the balcony. And people like, people that we quote are on our side, I would say National Council of Churches, AFL-CIO, Martin King, NAACP, uh, uh, the Joseph Rao, um, everybody said this, you should accept this. We said, okay, well, and SNCC always kind of worked with the people, and was Bob's idea. All right, we met in the church. He said, Bob's view is, okay, if you want them to accept it, make your presentation. And they presented, and they, talked about it, and the people said, we didn't come up here for this pretense. We came here believing that if you played by the rules, in fact, the rules would be observed. So that, it wasn't only the Johnson administration, it wasn't only, Hubert Humphrey, it was the whole liberal establishment that said, no, the rule, when it comes to power, these rules don't obtain. So at the end of the day, the refusal of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to deal with that, so-called compromise, and the kind of sense that power prevails, not the sense of, the ideals and the things that we, people espouse. Capitalism always trumps democracy. That, then people were able to see it firsthand. We, 64, I was 23, everybody else was around that. And they said, hey, this is the way it happens, huh? Not all that stuff we read in the books. This is the stuff that happened. It wasn't idealism. These were the rules that you put out there. This wasn't stuff we thought up. This was what you said the party rules were. And when it came to the game, the deal came down, this is the way it came down. And then people said, hey, we no longer trust you. I think people then started disengaging from the electoral process and what people considered foolishness.
Could you just add a little bit, step back to when you started to go to the convention, just line out what you had anticipated would happen, what the context
Right.
was.
I think when we started with first of all, we created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We went to all the counties in Mississippi. We held meeting after meeting. When the rules of the party said that, in fact, if you did these things, you would be seated because you would be representing these things and you function by the rules. So that when we went to Atlantic City, having functioned by the rules of the Democratic Party itself, we expected to be seated. We expected to be, the Democratic Party in Mississippi. And in fact, when we got to, Atlantic City, we found out the rules had changed.
Let me have you, if you would please, talk about the transition then after August 64 to Alabama and the way you thought about widening the project with new approaches to what I think a term you had used was the unqualified.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think of all the things I've done, I did in SNCC, I'm most proud and most, I like what we did in Lowndes best. The reason we went to Lowndes County was to deal with the kind of violence, particularly shooting of Viola Liuzzo. When we went there, you found a county that was 80% African American, and there were 4 registered voters. Now, the Alabama had a law that allowed you to have a political party at the county level. It also had a rooster which said "for the right" above it. Now the question then became, how do you achieve political power and how do you achieve regime change? Because before we were all talking about registering people to vote. We were all talking about, if you presented the facts, if you did that and you played by the rules, then, the rules would be supported. In 65, the view was, okay, here are the rules and how do we manipulate them to achieve our own, because we're not taking them to anybody because we know what that's going to be. So that we're saying, okay, if you have an 80% majority, then you ought to be able to run the county. So the office of sheriff, office of county assessor, when a tax assessor, county clerk, county court, the judge. And the problem was a lot of people, one, they did not read or write, and two, the idea, they didn't know a lot about the offices or responsibility offices, and three, you had to get them to believe they could do it. So what we did, Jack Menace, who was the research guy in Atlanta, who was absolutely brilliant, just absolutely brilliant, we researched the laws. And once we found out you could have a party on the county level, we could say, all right, what does it take to build a party at the county? So we then researched the roles and responsibilities of each of the offices. Now we knew that people were not going to sit down and read law books. So what we did was we created comic books which talked about the roles and responsibilities. We got people who would agree to run for sheriff, and we gave them the comic books, and we passed the comic books, and we put their pictures out there so that people could see them in that particular context. The other thing that we did,
if you had to learn in comic book form, do you think learning would be easier or harder?
was we created a propaganda piece called Mr. Black Man. And it's a story I developed with Jennifer Lawson, who is now working with PBS. She did the graphics, I did the text. And I used a phrase that I heard from a woman in Mississippi. She said, us black people have been using our mouths to do two things, to eat and say yassa. It's now time we say no. So I use that to create a sense that we have been, doing all these kinds of things, and we've been eating and saying yes, sir. It's now time we support Mr. Black Man, and it could be for, so-and-so for sheriff, so-and-so for tax assessor, so-and-so. Because our argument was, it's no use protesting police brutality by the sheriff. The way to deal with it is get a new sheriff who accedes to your view of the world. So then we, got people to believe. Now, as we went on the plantations, and and obviously there was a lot of reaction. They threw people out of their houses, violence and so forth. But what we found in Lowndes County, his name is Mr. Jackson. We found, he's a guy who owned his land. He was a guy who was the salt of the earth. When you see him, it looked like he's coming out of the earth. He was just very strong, and his view was he was quiet, he wasn't highly educated, all that, but he was very strong. And he gave us his house, and he would stay up all night to protect us with his gun. So that, so that basically our thinking in 65 had said, no more about going to take these rules. No, you got to create your own rules. You got to now assume power. You got to now, the discussion is no longer about protest. The discussion is about power. How do you now assume power, given you have the demographic, advantage, and how do you move that discussion? You do your research, you now understand how to go about it, and basically over time, convincing people like Mr. Hewlett and others to run for sheriff and others, that we were able to now be able to take over every position in the county. And I wrote a pamphlet, and I can't find it anymore. I gave away a lot of the stuff that I used to have, but there was a pamphlet that I wrote called, what would, paraphrasing a biblical thing, what would it profit a man to gain the vote and not be able to control it? Because at that point, the discussion of control and organization to move that control was particularly important.
Yeah. Let me ask a couple things. Let me have you describe, you alluded to the atmosphere of violence in Lowndes County and in that era. Can you say a little bit more? Because I know that, for example, Jonathan Daniels is killed
Yes.
in the county seat outside when they're sprung from jail that
Right.
Saturday morning, and just a little bit about the experience of being there and confronting that and observing that as a.
Well, I was not exactly, the reason we went into Lowndes was to show, after Jonathan was killed and Ruby was almost killed, that we were not going to be afraid. So we came in after that. And, particularly people like Stokely Carmichael, Ralph Featherstone, Willie Ricks, Bob Mance, we came in after that to make sure that we were going to show that we were not going to be run out. And so, I think for the community, which was, was there, saying that we ourselves would live in the community, we would be at risk with you, was the same thing. This house we lived in is interesting. Had no running water, so we had to prime the pump in the morning to get our water. It had one butane gas heater in the living room, and it had a hole in the roof, so when it rained, you have to have a pan in your bed so it wouldn't rain on the bed. But when you wanted to get relief, excuse me for a second.
Okay, we're back.
So we used to go to Selma to get a bath or take a shower, to go to the chicken shack, listen to some music and get some fried chicken, then drive back to the county. But people saw us living there, day to day, and I gave him comfort that, we were serious people, and that, the kind of violence that was visited upon the county by, the people who killed Daniels, and almost shot Ruby and so forth, that we would stand up to it. So, I think, for our living in the county, or living where or Southwest Georgia or Mississippi, that county, that was SNCC's trademark. We lived where we worked. As opposed to, dropping in and dropping out.
You personally, how did you deal with that kind of pressure, fear?
I think I always told myself there is fear there, and you shouldn't be paralyzed by it. I remember once I was driving with this young guy, John Jackson, Mr. Jackson's younger son. And these guys started chasing us with a pickup truck, and they had guns. And we were going, we must have, on those dirt roads, we were probably going 70, 80 miles an hour. And you tell yourself, that you could deal with it. I mean, you fantasize all sorts of stuff. Like, for example, I always thought that, okay, I could probably get away with from somebody who had a gun, but I had a problem with in Alabama because I thought they would use bombs. So I was more nervous about Alabama than I was Mississippi because I thought they would bomb in Alabama and shoot in Mississippi, you know, and therefore you kept telling yourself, okay, don't be paralyzed. This is a dangerous situation. Don't be paralyzed. Now, sometimes I remember I looked around in the trial of Collie Leroy Wilkins, who had shot Viola LaRusso. I looked around in the courtroom and I was the only person of color in the whole courtroom. And I started thinking, all right, what were the kids that I went to college doing? I mean, they were doing that. And I said to, you're really crazy. I mean, this is a little dangerous here. I think when you are in it, you have mechanisms that go into place that don't calculate the danger or deflect the danger from you. I think it's only if something actually happens to somebody it brings it home. I think when you get outside of it, you think about, that was a little interesting. So I think that I was affected. I always try to rationalize it. There were others in SNCC who were not so lucky, but I went through a series of rationalizations. That's the way I dealt with it.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the 65, 66 period in SNCC.
Okay.
And Carmichael replaces Lewis. And
Yes.
Whites are expelled. Just how you move through that period. If you can describe it and your perspectives on those transitions.
I think basically, which goes back to Atlantic City, the organization was becoming much more militant in the sense that the whole sense of, there was always that, remember in 1962, we had one group who felt, the philosophy, another group that felt this was a tactic. So basically, it started getting wider and wider and wider. And most people, John, again, a true believer, felt that you needed to continue to appeal to the people who were in power to change their ways. And we started believing less and less in that discussion. So, so that is, but this is something that wasn't, I don't think, looking back on the sudden discussion. It was, from the beginning, John had a view about if you taught people and they did the right things and, other people like that they would actually do the right things because in their hearts they were decent human beings. And we didn't believe any of that. So, at that point, it became a critical point, especially after our experience in Atlantic City.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more specifically about those two transitional moments? One, the decision to expel whites from SNCC, and then when Carmichael replaces Lewis.
I think that a lot of the stuff, the stuff about Carmichael replacing John, Stokely had just come out of Lowndes, or he had a lot more energy than John in terms that he probably reflected the mood of the black community and a lot of younger people in SNCC. And I think John held on to the ways that he knew and his views of, how things should be. I think that, the country, I mean, after Lowndes County and the whole discussion of Black Power, which came, at the Meredith March, and this whole discussion, the Washington Post and the New York Times started generating editorials which said, this is a bad thing. Even today, people say the good period in SNCC and then the bad period in SNCC. The good period represents when they viewed that SNCC was, believing in, the American dream and on all that, and the whites were involved in it. And then the bad period in SNCC was the period when SNCC did not feel that, the people who were making the decisions were ever going to be in their favor, and they needed to look to themselves to move the discussion. So, I mean, my sense, I think, again, the movement, the whole discussion, I think whether it was a Peg Leg Bates, to not expel, no, I don't think that's the word to say. I think the basic position of SNCC, and Jim Foreman articulated best, he said, look, the problem that we face is not in the black community. The problems we face are in the white community about the way they feel about things. So we think that it's important that the whites who are organizers and sympathetic to us should go to the white community and begin to organize in those communities to create, sympathetic relationships. I think the way it got characterized was probably, unfortunate, but I think that is what, people who had been with SNCC all this time, particularly the whites, felt that they had a home, and therefore, into this new thing was, very difficult. But some, like, who went and did a good job, and they, found the Southern Student Organizing Committee, but I think the way it was, the fight that went on in Peg Leg Bates, where I guess I was quoted as saying that, and I guess it was race is necessary but not sufficient, something like that. My sense was that I just think that we were trying to deal with problems. We were trying to figure out, how do we end these barriers, but, people started saying, well, how come you don't love white people anymore? What? We're facing, destruction at a lot of things. And, this discussion of, why don't you like whites anymore? We were saying to the white community, help us go into the white community to help make changes there. And so therefore, I think the way it was characterized and the way it's still characterized, I think is unfortunate, but it is what it is.
Well, it had the impact of one immediate and fairly short order impact was the funding was so much harder to
Oh,
get.
no question. And particularly people like Theodore Bickel coming out and, making his statements about it, and other people, it cut the funding tremendously.
Let me switch to a theme that takes us away. Well, it takes us into one of the dimensions of a widening frame of
Right.
consideration, I think,
Right.
in this era, and that's Vietnam.
Yes.
I want to ask. It's fascinating. I want to ask about your participation in Stockholm '66 and
Right,
'67.
right.
You go to Stockholm for the War Crimes Tribunal. Bertrand Russell, and can you spend a little time on that story?
Yeah, I
It must
can.
be very
But you've done your homework. See that. Let me go back a little bit.
Sure.
SNCC has made statements both on Vietnam and the Palestinian issues. And we made early statement on Vietnam, which impacted Julian greatly. But you remember at that time that the argument for some of the established civil rights movement was that you could only speak on the issues of race. You have no right to speak on the issues of Vietnam. Now, you also have to understand that most of us in SNCC, including myself, got one wise. And because, even before the tribunal piece, the view in SNCC was, you want us to fight a war over there when we're facing this here? What is the issue here? And then, so a number of the frame was set in terms of this discussion. And, so I went over, we were invited after a number of statements by the Bertrand Russell people to come, and I was asked to go. Because we had gone, SNCC people had gone to North Vietnam, Charlie Cobb and Julius Lester. I was invited to go, but I declined. But I went over there to represent SNCC in the group. And I get into London, and I really don't know much about the European scene. And I go to this dinner, 7-course dinner, with all sorts of liquor and stuff like that. And I've just come out of, Alabama. So what is all this? I mean, you don't know whether you're going to get too full or too drunk, but it's interesting. At that dinner was Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Isaac Deutscher, Dedinger. I mean, all the huge weights of European intellectual thing. And what struck me, I mean, this may be just a little silly, but both of those guys, Sartre and Bertrand Russell, such huge egos. They were about 5'5". I mean, at best. I mean, they were, little guys. I mean, and Dedinger, who was with the Yugoslavian, huge guy. I mean, so, and so we get to the thing, and we agree that we would, have this, and I would participate. Russell was not, he was at the dinner, but not very active, because he was 90, yeah, I mean, so. But the real leader was Sartre. What strikes me is that Sartre, smoking, would say whatever, and everybody would genuflect. D'accord. I mean, it was like, there was it was sort of like, he was the Pope, blessing his group. Everybody just all they would, agree. So I go back and I come back. We go to so this was, I think, in London. This was in London. So they agreed to have this thing in Stockholm. So I go to Stockholm, and again, it was the first time in Stockholm, and it's strange. The weather is just up and down, but it's the cleanest place I've ever been. A great clean place. So I'm sitting next to Simone de Beauvoir, and we're, they are talking. Colonel Havan Lo is from the Vietnamese, is talking, and what struck me about him is his absolute humility, about the war, about the mistakes that they've made, the need to change and correct and so forth. So every time Jean-Paul Sartre would say something, Simone de Beauvoir would turn to me and say, "Do you understand?" I looked at this. I didn't say to myself what I said about it. I said, "Yes." She said, "But do you comprehend?" I said, "Yes." Well, So then I asked Colonel Havanlo a series of questions. Because remember, they were using pellet bombs. This is when the United States started using pellet bombs. So I asked Colonel Havanlo, I said, in wars, there are generally, institutions that people tend to attack. Infrastructure, that is to say, the economic infrastructure, the factories, the political infrastructure, the capital and so forth, other things. And I said, it seems to me in guerrilla warfare, you don't have those infrastructures that you can attack. All you have is the people. So do you think that by definition of what you have, that a guerrilla warfare between, that the only way an industrialized country has to attack, against guerrilla warfare is to commit genocide? Because you have to attack the people. He said, yes. She never asked me again, did I comprehend or understand? Let me tell you something. She was pissed because I, implied that the war that the West had to fight against wars of national liberation had to be wars of genocide. She never asked me another question.
Let's take a little break.
The reverence that Sartre was held in. I mean, he was. Now, I will tell you, at that point, I was put on several lists.
I might ask you that when we come back. John, you gotta give me a heads up on that. So, we're back on?
We're back.
Okay. Please.
Go
Did
ahead.
you want to say that on the tape?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Please.
Because one of the things that I found out is I was put on several lists, mainly FBI and CIA, and they followed me wherever I went, and whenever whether I was whenever I came back to the United States, they would, I would be surrounded by agents, and I would say, "Oh, you just picked me out at random." They looked at me, and they search everything, and they make sure that, to see if I had any documents and stuff. In 1970, on my way to Africa, the British, I was going to go into London. They stopped me at Heathrow. In that time, you didn't have, planes going to Africa every day. And they would not let me in London. So I had to sleep in the airport for 2 nighs. And they took me on an armed guard and put me on a plane going to Africa. Now, so, at that point, I was viewed as an enemy of the state, and was treated as such by both the FBI and the CIA. Now, the FBI was a little more aggressive in the sense that they would, if I were going to go, I was going to go speak at Cornell, and the FBI went and said to the people there who invited me, "Don't you know who this guy is? Why are you inviting him?" So they tried to discourage. I was told that. But when I do have my FBI files, CIA files, and IRS files, and when I look at the work that the FBI did, as a taxpayer, I'm ashamed that they did such sloppy work. So, I thought the CIA did a little better, but the FBI, they just need to pull up their socks. They need to do better work.
This was Freedom of Information
Freedom
Act
of Information, that's
request.
right, yeah.
I need to take a little break, so
Okay.
let's.
Yeah.
Okay, we're back on.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that we started using pellet bombs. What was that?
Yeah, they were called cluster bombs. You'd have one big bomb. A cluster bomb is you have one big bomb and had a lot of little bombs in it. And then once those bombs got close to the ground, they'd explode, and BB pellets would be in those pellets, and they couldn't destroy a building or anything. They were just designed to kill and injure people.
Thank you.
Let me. We've already begun in important ways to touch on the whole question of where this work is leading and some of its implications, because you've mentioned already that you're closely watched by the federal government and all of its agencies of surveillance and national security. But I'm very interested in the story of the development of the effort that culminates in Tanzania in '73 in the 6th Congress of the Pan African.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that, Stokely Carmichael and I talked a lot about moving the discussion, because let's say after the Atlantic City Convention, I began to understand that you had to think much differently. You could not keep asking people, who were in fact benefiting from the status quo to change the status quo. And that I felt that it was important that as we people went through the discussion of Black Power and what we had to do in our communities and so forth, that as I looked at it, it was clear to me that there was nothing in the Black communities, whether you're talking about Harlem or all these other places, where you had any kind of economic infrastructure that could make a difference. So therefore, while rhetorically and politically it was kind of good to talk about how these communities could defend themselves and do for themselves and so forth, they didn't grow any wheat, they didn't, they had no agriculture, they had no industry, they had nothing, and they had no resources that could make a difference. So therefore, the question of making alliances and beginning to work with people outside of the country, particularly the African continent, which was in this kind of emerging itself, came important to me. At that point, I met Paolo. His name is Brown, and CLR James, the noted West Indian authority on cricket and intellectual, and also the man who wrote the Black Jacobins. And they had talked about the fifth, and 45,
yeah.
in 1945. And we thought it would be important to get African people on the continent of Africa and the diaspora to begin talking about how there could be a corporation, to help, what people in the United States had and the diaspora was, technical skills, engineers, that, kind of thing. And, what Africans had, land, resources, and so forth. And how and also the other thing that was going on at the time was the liberation movements. So how could we be supportive of all those kinds of things? So we went around to, the President Nyerere agreed to host the conference. And we went around with CLR James. I went around with CLR James and Fletcher Robinson, who was a medical doctor. And we went to talk to, we went to talk to a number of African leaders. We went to the OAU. In terms of organizing the Sixth Pan-African Congress, I was named the Secretary General. And that I was Secretary General. You were talking, I'm now 32 years old while rolling. And I go, I go to talk to Sekou Touré, the president of Guinea. And it's interesting. He We went there for. I stayed in Guinea for 2 days, and then I was told the president will see you. And at 32 years old, Sekou Touré is known as. And I walk into the office, and his office, and he has this entourage of people. And I have my notepad, and I make the speech. And I mean, I can tell you, I was perspiring from both arms, but I tried to maintain my calm and cool and collectedness, and presented the case. And he agreed. I mean, he was more inclined to agree. He invited me to lunch at his place, and we had some fish and rice. It was very nice. I went to see Forbes Burnham in Guyana, to talk about it. So we had, and I also talked to a number of radicals in the discussion. Now with the Sixth Pan African Congress, we had the same kind of problem. State power versus insurgents, particularly in Caribbean. And what happened was that in and also in Ethiopia, what happened was the state governments said that they would not participate in the Sixth Pan African Congress from the Caribbean if the insurgent types were invited and allowed to come. And the Tanzanian government sided with the governments. Then also the Eritrea, the conflict with Eritrea was going on. And, the Tanzanian government also said that they couldn't come. But the Tanzanian government was supportive of the liberation movement, so they were there en masse. And the conference itself was a big success. Even people today, I mean, it's interesting. Professor from Harvard who taught Obama, and his name's Ogletree. Charles Ogletree, he was at the Sixth Pan African Congress, and he reminded me, there were a lot of people. Barack Obama, Mary Baraka was there. I mean, there were a lot of people who were there in terms of. So the people who were there from the United States were the people who had been involved in the movement and who were moving along. You had that group. You had the liberation movements. You had the various African states. You had, and I think it was an important statement in terms of, what we needed to think about. But the problem was, once that conference was over, we didn't have the infrastructure some things happened, in the sense that the support for the liberation movements continued. Other things that happened was that we did send some technical people to Tanzania, and some others moved to Tanzania. And there was a lot of intellectual discussion back and forth, particularly around Tanzania and others. But I think the kind of broad discussion that we wanted to have, and maintaining that discussion and building on it, we didn't have the infrastructure. So I think that it pointed the direction that we needed to go in, but it did not allow us to really have the kind of relationships that we wanted. But the Sixth Pan African Congress grew out of our view that, in fact, if we were going to deal with something, the economic issue was going to be important. And we did not have anything that was fundamental to the economic development of our communities in our communities. That was particularly important.
Yeah. Let me pull you back inside that
Okay.
story just to say a little bit more about how how the story unfolded so that you emerged in that role as Secretary General. It's really quite exceptional.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly the the intellectual godfather was C.L.R. James. He wrote the manifesto, he wrote the call and stuff like that. Um, I think that I mean, for better or for worse, I've always, in some ways, been perceived in SNCC as uh, an intellectual type. I mean, whether that's good or bad, that's I'm not, and therefore, and I also had, and I guess people assumed I had some organizational skills. Um, so when, and I put, and I understood the question, and I think as I put the time and energy into it, people felt that uh, not only did I understand the issues, but looking back, and it was a little bold, my thinking I could deal with the heads of government and heads of states and talk to them about a proposal and get them involved in it. But once, I think what gave me cover, I think two things. First, see if CLR's involvement in the conversation gave Nyerere the comfort that this was a serious conversation. And then Nyerere's involvement in the conversation made other heads of state think that this was serious. So therefore, I had cover that I just if I didn't mess it up, it would be all right. I think that's kind of as I see it.
Yeah. It's a very interesting story. Let me take you back to 68 for a couple things.
Okay.
Two main things I want to ask about in 68. One is the bookstore and press.
Oh yeah, Drum and Spear.
Yeah. Another is just the climate of that year with King, RFK, Nixon in the fall.
Right.
Yeah, elected.
Yeah. I think I had come back. I decided to come back to Washington.
Oh, forgive me? Can I ask one other thing in front
Okay.
of that? Because it comes chronologically in front, and I meant to ask this. You declined the invitation to go to North Vietnam. Is there
Yeah.
an interesting story to tell about that decision?
No, I just thought that I had just come back from the War Crimes Tribunal, and we were invited. Given SNCC, I didn't want to be the person who was always doing something. Now I was invited to go to Russia, but I didn't go because I thought in February it'd be too cold. But then the other one about North Vietnam, I didn't want to go because I had just been, other people should, go.
Okay, the bookstore and the press.
After I came back from the War Crimes Tribunal, I decided to settle in Washington, and we decided Marvin Holloway, Ann Holloway, Charlie Cobb, Judy Richardson. We decided information was important, and we decided that a bookstore and a press would be good. And so we opened a bookstore on 14th and Fairmont Street, dealing with African and African American history, and also things that dealt with, Palestine, dealt with Vietnam, dealt with issues of war and stuff like that. And it was a great political venture, but I'm not sure it was a great business venture in the sense that we did a lot of stuff, but I don't think we ever made any serious money. But it was important because people remember it today. In fact, there is a plaque on that building, that the bookstore was there. And Drum and Spear, we were able to publish, with CLR's book and, some other books that we did, Palestinian poetry and other things, Book of African Names, and so forth. So, I mean, I think it was about how do you now organize information about the African community. And we, in addition to the Drum Spear Bookstore and Drum Spear Press, we had the Center for Black Education. So that information and education now became important. Now, how do you begin to think about the world differently? How do you begin to read different books? How do you begin to do things that were different? So, I mean, I think that was our thinking in terms of, why we established the, bookstore and the press.
Yeah. Your reaction to
Oh yeah, King said Ivanhoe and I were going to make a speech somewhere in Pennsylvania, and we were riding in a Volkswagen. Those Volkswagens those days. If you were going uphill, it was a struggle. Downhill, you were all right. And we, heard about King being killed, and it was like a total shock. I mean, total disbelief, because I don't think that any of us, even though we knew that this was a dangerous situation, the concept of King being shot was a bit beyond what most people would conceive to be within the realm of possibility. And that when he was killed, it was a shock to everybody. Because I think, most African Americans thought if they could do that to him, what are they now prepared to do to us? And then we came back, and we were in Washington, and the Poor People's March headquarters was 14th and U Street, and I think the next day or so, Stokely and others started, making a lot of noise about, King's death, and they started marching up, 14th Street. And, what people characterize as rebellions took place. And, it was interesting. There were two things going on at the same time. Externally to the white community, there was a lot of hostility. Internally, even in the actual rebellion, like there was a lot of peace and calm. So if somebody said, it was, people were very polite to each other. If somebody said, well, can I help you get this television so you could, take it away? I mean, the thing was very, to each other, the sense of solidarity was very strong, and externally it was very, so me and I remember I was sitting on the hill on 13th Street, just looking and seeing what's happening, and it was, it was just fascinating. I was just watching it, and I thought, well, this people, there was nothing that could be done. I mean, I thought that people were leading with the frustration. I thought it would get them nowhere. I thought that and about $1.50 would get them on the bus, but that's what they wanted to do. I think that the reaction of the mayor, Walter Washington, at that point when he declared martial law and had tanks on Columbia Road and 14th Street was quite interesting. And again, was another sense of what power will do, analogous to, the Atlantic City. I mean, to protect property, to protect its own interests. So that was, to me, a big lesson. I think, that, in 68 also, I think the other impact was Bobby Kennedy being shot. Because I think, Bobby Kennedy, I think he really showed a great deal of humanity and sophistication after King was shot. I mean, probably of all the people, public people, he understood. I mean, it was not an intellectual discussion with him. It was, he had been there, and I think his words were really appropriate. And what he said in South Africa was also very good. So, I mean, I think he found his voice that was really very, very important. But then, I think what people began to see, and then with the Chicago Convention, with, the people watching. I mean, I think for the King's death and Kennedy's death, people just thought about this as a very violent country. I mean, and, where you had, somebody like Rapp saying, violence is as American as cherry pie. I mean, that kind of mindset. I think the Chicago piece, at least for me, I mean, I was kind of not involved in it, in the sense, I mean, when I say not involved, I was not only physically not there, I was emotionally not there. And I thought it had a lot more to do with Vietnam and, and people acting out their sense of frustration in terms of ending a war that, people felt people were dying and there was no way to deal with it. I mean, people felt that the government was not listening. And, while I know a lot of the players there, I wasn't, I mean, I was an observer. I was not a participant. I mean, I just either physically or emotionally, I just was watching it.
Let's take a short break.
Okay.
Okay, we'll come back on. Okay, we'll come back on.
My sense is I've done a number of things. And I've seen a lot of these, movies and so forth. And as I think about it, and it's interesting because Stokely and I used to talk about stuff, and we used to view this like an onion. We knew that the basic issue was economic. We were brought to the United States for economic reasons, and the only way we were going to be able to deal with was the economic issue, dealing with the economic issues. But there were several layers and several barriers between where we were, 40 years ago and where we could get today. So as I think about it, it seems to me that, the modern civil rights era, what I call the political era, starting in 55, really ended in 2008. That the whole thing, we had 3 accomplishments in between that time. We ended segregation and public accommodations. We did voting rights and spread it to the South, and we did political organization, electoral politics. With the election of Obama, all the presumed barriers that we had before us, are now gone. Now, but before 55, we had to look at the NAACP and the things that they did for us. They allowed the country, they functioned in the courts. So they allowed the country to now say segregation is no longer the law of the land. It reversed Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and established a new thing, a new frame of reference in 1954. So, so you look at that, and then before that, the whole fight to end chattel slavery and establish the African American as part of the American society. So you look at, so these things don't exist in one-offs. They exist in a continuum. I think at this point, we are now able to do what Stokely and I discussed 40 years ago. We're now able to focus on the economic discussion because what we have is, an information economy and things, manufacturing and so forth, while important, they are not the drivers. I mean, intellectual property and the ability to talk, to conceive ideas and move the discussion is particularly important. And that the kind of literacy that's necessary that, in order going forward, it, includes English, but includes math and computers. So therefore, we now have to think and conceive of these things, a lot differently. And I think my role and role of people like myself is to understand what the fundamentals are. Now, one of the things that I was talking to Bob Moses the other day, and he was saying that nothing we did was really radical. Getting people to vote, sitting at a lunch counter and organizing politically is not radical. What was radical is who we tried to include in the discussion. So that to me is the same fight that we have to understand we have to bring. That we have to broaden the economic base. We have to include, particularly not only African Americans, but poor whites, who are being used as soldiers for, for purposes that they don't even care about them. They call them heroes, and then when they come back here, nobody cares about them. Native Americans and so forth. So we now have to say, all of these people at the bottom now have to be part of the American economy, and they have to begin to get a quality education that allows them to participate in the American economy. And those people who have intellectual property should be able to monetize them and create wealth and institutions. Now, that, given even today's discussion about who gets cut off and who doesn't, that is a radical concept. Nothing I said about what we should be doing is radical. What is radical is who is included in the conversation. And to me, that is a lesson that we have to talk to the young people about, because they keep looking back at what we did in the 50s, 60s, and so forth, and trying to figure out what are the lessons learned. The lessons learned has to be the broadest inclusion of people, not the particular act or so forth. What we did, that is what we have to figure out. And how do we now put that in an economic context? Seems to me that is what I'm interested in doing going forward.
Mr. Cox, I really want to thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Okay.
We appreciate your time.
Now you've done your homework. I would say,
It's a real
I must say, you. I guess. What do you do?
historian. So
Yes. So it's definitely clear that you're a historian.
Who would you like for me to do a video on next? What are your thoughts about this video? Please share them in the comments. Please be honest when answering these questions. Share this video with anyone you deem necessary. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.